Hi, everybody. I hope you are doing well. We are in week 12 right now, and we're going to be covering quite a bit of material today. So, if you need to pause, if you need to take a little breather, if you need to stop the video for a moment, of course, feel free because I know that these can be pretty extended lectures with a lot of things going on. So you can go back and forth to the video as much as you need to. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So we are moving into 1980s to the current era. So initially, and you'll see this in your weekly message in Canvas too, if you go under announcements or if you have that set up to go to your email. This was supposed to originally be broken up into two. I was going to have a discussion about the 1980s to the 2000s and then 2000s to the current era. But so much of the events of the 1990s and early 2000s and mid 2000s, all of them are so linked. I figured it would just be a whole lot easier to put everything together. And that way, too, you've got these condensed notes. If you're saying, oh, well, this work was published in 1998, what was kind of going on then? You just have this clear, quick reference point. I've also got this and other materials under week 12. So if you go to the Canvas class and you go to modules in week 12, you're going to see a number of things. So you're going to see, first off, your two readings for the week, which are the excerpts from Rabbit is Rich, which we'll be talking about shortly, and excerpts from Microserfs. So those are both PDFs under week 12. If you have any issues with them, just let me know. Underneath that, you will see the 1980s to current era notes. So the things I'm talking about now and giving you the high points, you'll see that information outlined for you. So that way, if you want to go back and look at specific points, you're covered. Okay. At the very top of week 12, of course, is our lecture, and that will stay up so you can go back to it as needed. Finally, under week 12, you will see two drop boxes. One of them is for your classwork assignment, and it is titled Updike and Coupland Assignments, and that will be for your classwork that we'll talk about shortly. And then you also will have a drop box for Essay 2. Both of those things, the classwork and the essay, are due by the end of the day, Friday, April 3rd, so 11:59 p.m. And with your Essay 2, in the previous lecture, I talked more about it. I've got some notes that I referenced, but if you do have any questions, let me know. And with that essay, if you would like for me to look at a rough draft, you do have up through 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, April 2nd to send me a draft to review, and I'll be glad to help you out. So just let me know how I can assist in any way. So let's kind of move into our things that we need to discuss for this week and go through the high points of the historical timeline, go into the readings, and I'm going to give you a little bit of insight on the third and final paper that will be due the last day of class, but we're not going to talk about that heavily until next week. So we're going to cover some of the main topics that you will need to know to get your work prepped. And if there's anything that you need to ask me about after looking at this, of course, please feel free to get in touch. So let's start with our 1980s to the current era. This is a lot of time to cover, so I'm only going to talk about the high points. And of course, you've got this in Canvas for you under week 12 that you can reference anytime that you like. So let's start with our 1980s. 1980s were a very particular time in business, economic, and political history in America. People had really struggled in the 70s. They had seen Watergate, which is talked about in your previous notes, 1940s to 1970s, the Vietnam War. There had been gas crises, economic crises. People felt like the world had turned upside down in the 70s. So they wanted some stability in the 1980s. And that's where conservative politics really came into play. There was a new rise of conservatism in the 1980s because people felt like this would keep them more economically stable and secure for the future. So this is what really ushered Ronald Reagan into office. So I did put some things here together about the new right in the 1980s, that folks were increasingly flocking to conservative causes, and they felt like this would return the country to a more prosperous, stable form than we had seen in the 70s and in the late 60s. So Reagan was definitely a president where his name is attached to a lot of different things, and one of which would be Reaganomics. So this bullet here that I'm looking at, Reaganomics basically meant that government would interfere less when it came to business, as far as like regulations and taxation and things of that nature go. He also promised big tax cuts, and he was a huge proponent of this idea of the trickle down economy. Basically, if you give big tax cuts, tax breaks to business owners, then they would definitely put that back into the economy in some way. So this is very specifically tied to Reagan. You'll hear Reaganomics, you'll hear trickle down economics. That was very much element of this era. There were some issues with Reaganomics, but people still felt very strongly that Reagan's economic plan worked. So even after some issues occurred, like the stock market crash in '87, people still felt very comfortable with the economic direction of the United States. And so after Reagan left office, his ideas were still so popular that his vice president was pretty much swept into office, and that is George H.W. Bush. Okay? I did want to mention very briefly some things to do with the U.S. on the global stage during the 1980s. We've talked about through other works about communism and how the U.S. was devoted to limiting the spread of that. And then when we talk about unions, people were worried that unions were communist. So communism has been a component in American business talk for a long time. Reagan believed that communism should be tamped out everywhere. So the U.S. government at this point in time, in the 1980s, started to really involve itself in world politics so that it could help eliminate the spread of communism. And sometimes this foreign intervention didn't go in the best direction, because in one intervention issue, it was discovered that the White House had sold arms to Iran, and then had funneled money to Nicaraguan rebels through these transactions. So, of course, this was referred to as the Iran-Contra scandal and led to some convictions that were later overturned. So, as we'll keep seeing with each presidency that's coming up, lots of scandals. Ever since Nixon, it seems like there has to be some big scandal. And all joking aside, there's always some sort of thing that's emerging, probably because it's very hard in this era of constant information to keep anything scandalous a secret. I want to close the 1980s by talking about the yuppie. This will be important to how you might talk about your question with Rabbit is Rich. In the 1980s, the yuppie emerged as this symbol of sometimes the best and the worst of the decade. This was a baby boomer who was college educated, had a good job, and bought a ton of stuff. Nice cars, nice clothes, nice house, had a membership at the country club, just wealthy and showy about it. So this was the biggest, other than maybe like the early 1950s post-World War II boom, this is probably the biggest consumerist upsurge in American history with the yuppie. Just buy, buy, buy. And this was really people thought a response to the economic downturns of the 70s. Now we can afford stuff. We're going to, get all these nice things that we want. I want to move into some things to do with the 1990s. This was the era when both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton were president. And during this time period, we have a lot of pendulum switch in terms of politics. So George H.W. Bush was popular for a time. The economy went down. He was basically pushed out. Bill Clinton was a clear winner in the presidential election in 1992. And he did pass a lot of great laws, but of course, his tenure was definitely tainted by the scandal that led to his impeachment. So we have these like really highs and lows. Like these presidents are coming to office, everything's very positive, they're just swept right in, and then there's a scandal, or they are not working well with Congress, or things of that nature. So of course, no presidential tenure is perfect, and all the ones we're looking at are good cases in point of that. I do want to note about the 1990s, the U.S., this was the first time when it was completely considered the world superpower. And a lot of people argue, oh, well, no, and after World War II, the U.S. was a superpower. The Soviet Union, or of course, as we know now, Russia, was a strong power in the world. Heck, England was a strong power in the world up until the 1990s. When the fall of the Soviet Union occurred, the U.S. took center stage and began becoming more involved in issues of diplomacy, global conflict, things of that nature. So we see a very different approach to relating to other countries once the U.S. takes this superpower role on. So I've listed out some things, some political, some global conflicts that the U.S. was involved in that you're welcome to take a look at. I do want to note as well that the 1990s are often remarked at as not only there were some positive economic things, there was definitely strong globalization happening, but unfortunately it was also an era of strong violence, major bombings. You see here on this list violence against very specific groups of people, and this is where we first see the uprising school shootings with Columbine. So it was known as an era of pretty highs and lows, and people talk about the 60s as tumultuous, but the 90s were pretty tumultuous too. We have war, we have global intervention, we have beloved presidents who come crashing down, we have violence, we have economic highs, we have everything going on in the 90s. I want to move to then our 2000s to current. Of course, the main thing that really marks this era is 9/11, which really set the stage for how we deal with security, how the government relates to people. So many different things are affected by this, and of course, I know you can read over these notes on your own, so I'm not going to harp on all of this so heavily. But we do have this kind of consistent thing where, of course, George W. Bush was put into office, and there's definitely some controversy that went through his time. He passed some legislation that people were thrilled about and some that people were not. And then, of course, we move into the era where Barack Obama is president, and I've mentioned here and broken down a lot of the policies that he enacted. And, of course, we are in our current era with our current president, Donald Trump, and noted here as well some of the policies he's passed and some of the legislation that has been on his desk since day one. Okay? So knowing that you will be able to read through this just fine, and if you need to reference this for an essay or a final exam, great, you have it all in one place. I didn't want to read a bunch of notes to you because I figured you could easily do that on your own, and you've got probably a lot of things going on this week, so I wanted to have maybe one less thing for you to worry about, and having all of your notes in one place will be very helpful. I want to move then next to talking about, and of course, as an aside here, there's a lot of economic discussion when it comes to the 2000s to current. We have technology being a huge part of the economy. We have the real estate bubble bursting. We had a huge recession, of course, entering into the 2010s. So I just wanted to reference that point as well. So I did want to go next to our readings. And we have two for this week, Rabbit is Rich and Microserves. So with Rabbit is Rich, I did give you a pretty short selection, and same thing with Microserves. I wanted you to be able to have time to really process these ideas, and since we did lose a week, I didn't want to cram everything in. So instead of having, say, 30 pages, you might have 7 to 15. So hopefully that'll help, and you still get the idea of what was going on during that time period without maybe being too overloaded. So that's the idea there. So let me pull up Rabbit is Rich, and we're going to talk about that. So Rabbit is Rich, published in 1981, and this is a work by John Updike, and this is part of a bigger series. So our central character is Harry Angstrom, known as Rabbit, and this author, John Updike, published a series of books on his life from the time he was born. He was in high school, a basketball star. He has married a pageant queen. He has now bought this car dealership, and well, I'm sorry, he has ascended to a higher role in the car dealership. He definitely didn't buy it, he inherited it, so backtracking there. And since I'm not editing videos, you'll get to see any little blooper moments going on here. So, Rabbit Angstrom, through all of these books about Rabbit that John Updike has written, and don't quote me on it, I believe there's maybe 6-7 books on Rabbit, they're supposed to follow the sense of the American dream, or this is the typical American guy. He is in a middle-class family, he marries pretty well, he does pretty well financially, and eventually, of course, he will pass away. So it's like, here's this encapsulated life in this series. So the chapter that I want you to look at is our opening chapter of the book, and it's really tells you a lot about what was going on in the late 70s, early 80s, as far as the economy in America is concerned and how people adapt to it. And it's telling you this is kind of what middle to maybe upper middle class looks like during this time period. Okay? So, of course, we have our location being the car dealership that Rabbit co-owns with his wife. His father-in-law has died, and he is no longer a salesperson. He is partial owner of this, so he's invested in this company. And this is a Toyota dealership. So he's thinking about how this relates to the gasoline crisis in America. And in the late 70s, gasoline was at such a shortage. You saw this in the chapter. People were lining up at gas stations, doing every little trick to get every drop of gas in their tanks. They were fighting each other for gas. People were violent when it came to this gas shortage because in the 60s, everybody, in early 70s, everybody was driving around, cruising around the cars, loving life. The last thing you were worried about was the cost of gas. But at this point, we get to the late 70s, early 80s, you cannot find gasoline. You can barely make it to work on the gasoline that you can find. And any gas that you can find is, through the roof price, and you don't know if you can afford it, plus be able to go to work. So very fraught time, but he's thinking about how his dealership is dealing with this, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Next in the chapter, we do have him and this head salesman, Charlie, talk about the gas crisis and how this ties into, relationships with other countries that America has, how this ties into companies making money off of the oil crisis or not making money. And they start talking about their past and how much they love those big gas guzzling cars that drank up gas like crazy and looked like they would never be able to be in a wreck because they were just these big hulking metal things. So these two are, looking back on their past. They are thinking about their future, and you see two very different perspectives here. Rabbit is coming from one perspective, while Charlie is sort of in that semi-fight the man mode. Like, can you believe how greedy these corporations are? And can you believe that they're going to, keep these gas prices this way and hurt the little guy? Rabbit talks about things a little differently, but I'm going to hold off on that because that's one of your questions later on. And then finally, at the end of this section, I didn't even give you the full chapter because I felt like you would get a pretty good picture of everything. This young couple who looks very rural comes in looking at cars, and Rabbit, instead of sort of assuming that they can't afford anything, kind of like Charlie's assuming, Charlie doesn't seem to be too excited about these folks coming in. He just gets so excited to have the company that he's talking about politics and the cars, and then he offers them a test drive, and that's where we end. So we get this little microcosm of the car dealership that Rabbit co-owns and that he works for. So I've got a few questions that go along with this section, and that will basically take care of Rabbit is Rich. Because microserves, we're going to look at one small section today, and then there will be for next week another small section. So it's going to be broken up between weeks 12 and 13. So let's start with our first question. I'm going to talk about that and then hand over a couple to you. So with the first study question, the backdrop of this chapter is the gasoline crisis in America of the late 1970s. How, according to the chapter, is Rabbit's dealership dealing with that crisis? What do these strategies say about the relationships among businesses, the economy, and global resources? So, according to Rabbit, his dealership is dealing with that crisis by really promoting their product. They are selling Toyotas, and during this time period, a Toyota was going to be much more fuel efficient than anything that was made in America. So the Fords, the Chryslers, things like that that were being made in America, people couldn't sell because they took too much gas, even though people wanted to be able to buy American. So Rabbit's dealership is dealing with that crisis by really pushing their product and by really saying, hey, what we're selling is going to make sure that you can keep driving and that you're not going to spend every last penny that you have on gas. And then what do these strategies say about these relationships? So I think for one it says that businesses during a time of economic crisis have to be adaptable. Luckily, Rabbit's dealership is selling a car that's gas efficient, but he's got to figure out some way anyway to make sure his product works for a not so great economy. Okay? And every business will have to do that. And then global resources. During this time, we had this very big push, buy American, support the American economy, support the American worker. This kind of shows us that, unfortunately, businesses may not put American-made products first if their money is on the line and if the consumer just cannot get on board with what they're selling. Because during this time, American cars were just not fuel efficient, so dealerships could not even attempt to sell them. So if I'm talking about how they're dealing with this crisis, how that says something about the relationships, it definitely says a lot about adaptability and about how important profit has to be during this time of economic downturn. So this brings me to classwork grade number 1. For this one, if you will answer questions 2 and 3, and do that in, how about 3 to 4 sentences apiece. So question number 2, in this chapter, Rabbit appears to feel that he has finally made it in terms of business success. What indicates to him that he has made it? So think about what he has, how people treat him, things of that nature. Okay. Number 3, Rabbit addresses the positives and negatives of being middle-aged. What, according to him, is gained and lost as he ages? Do his values and beliefs align him more with the conservative upsurge of the late 70s to early 80s, or is he more allied with the counterculture of the late 60s? So what is his attitude? And he talks a lot about and thinks a lot about aging, and talks about how people's looks change as they age, how their financial situation changes. So what is he saying about this, and what kind of value system does this seem to mean that he holds? And of course, I'll give you the caveat, as you know, we're getting into more contemporary works, and there is often some maybe less than appealing language and concepts. I want you to get a sense of what working life is like, and there's definitely some things in there that may not be the most appropriate language. Skim over it. Focus on the things that are important to American business, that show us about the values, that show us about the culture here. So if you can overlook it, I can, all set. Okay. So Rabbit is Rich is our first reading. You've got your first classwork assignment. Answer questions number 2 and number 3 in 3 to 4 sentences each. I will give you a second classwork assignment, but we'll hold off on that for just a moment. I want to move to one thing that I'll talk about really briefly, and then we'll expand on it more next week. So just so far, if you have a running track of things, I've given you some high points on the 1980s to current era with some of the main things to do with the economy, domestic and global issues, our leadership, etc. Then moved into talking about Rabbit is Rich, and you got your first classwork assignment. Please note that there will be a second classwork assignment that comes with microserfs I'll talk about shortly. And then finally, the big thing. You do have your essay due, essay number 2. Make sure you look over your guidelines carefully. You talk to me about any questions and turning in the 2 classwork items plus the paper by 11:59 p.m. Friday, April 3rd. Okay? That gives you 3 attendance credits. That also gives you 300 points for the week for the classwork, and of course a very important essay grade for the essay. Rough drafts, Thursday, April 2nd would be the last time to email me something, end of day, 11:59 p.m. I want to give a brief nod to what's going on with your third and final essay, and that is going to be due the last day of class, which is Friday, April 24th. I want to go ahead and give you a heads up about this because you may be working at different paces. That way, if you have something in mind, fantastic. You can kind of keep moving forward and asking me questions as they come up. Okay? So for the final essay, I'm asking you to look at 3 different works, one from the 40s to 70s, one from the 80s to 2000s, and one from the current era, and be able to talk about a common theme that you see in each of those. You can talk about more if you like. You could talk about 2 from 1940s to 1970s, 2 from 80s to 2000s, and 1 from the current era, as long as you have 1 from each era here. And if you see, I did break this up so that you know what works belong to which one. So there's 3 works under the 1940s to 70s, 3 under 80s to 2000s, and 2 under the current era. When you think about themes, it shouldn't be a word. It shouldn't be like the theme is love, or the theme is hard work, or the theme is mean bosses. It should be something that would cover several different works, not millions of different works, because love could be a theme for every piece of literature that's ever existed in the world. So you want something a little bit more focused. A theme, I've given you some examples here. And incidentally, this sheet is under week 13 in Canvas. So if you want a reference point, that would be where this is located. Okay? So examples of themes might be this: the disjointed identity of the middle class worker, teamwork in the white collar workplace, the increasing importance of branding oneself at work. So something really narrow and specific that you see that would cover one work from each one of these eras that are noted above. So your task in this paper is to show how is this single theme present in these different works. What do the characters say? What do they do? What are some plot points that tie into that? Okay, so that way we can see, okay, this theme is reinforced in each one. Okay? I want to keep this last paper pretty straightforward because I know you've probably got a lot of things going on that you're juggling during this time. So this one is hopefully going to be your simplest essay, but it's not to be worried about until a little bit later. This one is due Friday, April 24th, so if you're juggling a lot of things, no worries. I do want to also note I have been working ahead to post your readings up in Canvas. I know that you probably have 100 things going on right now, but if you are inclined to read further, just go to your modules and go to your other weeks, week 13, week 14, week 15. I have those readings posted up for you if you want to read ahead and just have one less thing to worry about, but that's completely up to you. So as long as by the time this week is over, on April 3rd, you have in your Essay 2 and you have your 2 classwork assignments in, that is the main consideration there. So otherwise, do whatever you feel is comfortable. Okay. Now let's finally go to microserfs. So microserfs, of course, talks about workers at Microsoft. And I wanted to bring in this work because we are in a brand new era when it comes to the 90s in particular, but beyond that as well, where businesses are popping up devoted to tech. in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that just wasn't a thing. But here we've got a whole new industry cropping up and people making a ton of money off of it. And our tech culture has really created a certain type of American culture, so it's extremely important to talk about. We're only going to focus on Friday right now. So I sent you, or I've posted under week 12 in Canvas, an excerpt that includes 2 journal entries from our narrator. One titled Friday, one titled Saturday. So I'm splitting this up into 2, basically chapter 1, chapter 2. And we're going to talk about Friday this week and Saturday next week for microserves. So you're responsible for just a tiny little portion there technically. And if you've read ahead, fantastic. That's one less thing to worry about. So let's talk about Friday. This is written as journal entries, and it has that feel. So when we think about this as a particular type of literature, it's not a poem. It doesn't feel quite like nonfiction or like fiction. It's not really a play. It's a whole new sort of thing. We're reading the thoughts of this narrator, Daniel, and it reads like a diary. He's not terribly concerned if he has great flow or poetic language. He's trying to get his thoughts out there. So keeping that in mind when you read this is definitely intended to read very much like a journal. So let's talk about Friday. We start with this being the day that Daniel is focusing on, and a certain incident happens. We have a lot of names floating around, so I'll try to kind of keep those going and tie back to those names so that we can keep a running list of this cast of characters. Because keep in mind, he works here, so he knows these people. We don't know these people, so we feel like we're in the middle of a conversation that we got no context for. So Friday begins with one of Daniel's co-workers, Michael, locking himself in his office because this guy on staff who's like a legend, Bill, decided to tease him about his work skills, about the code that he was writing. And you see that happening in some workplaces, like people in the same department, in the same industry, just really tease each other and pick at each other. Sometimes it's all in good fun, sometimes it's not. Well, in this case, whatever Bill's intention was, Michael is not happy, and he's locked himself in his office. So the narrator, concerned about him, takes his coworker Todd to the supermarket so that they can find flat food to slide under Michael's office door, which is kind of sweet and funny at the same time. And while they're talking, or while Daniel is talking about this errand, we get a really strong sense into what it's like to be a Microsoft worker. You work pretty late. You may not go home until some people are heading to bed or just waking up the next day. They are really, really focused on what it is they're doing, and because of their precision, they want what they want when they want it. So you get a very particular kind of worker who can sit and focus on something for hours at a time, and it doesn't seem initially so bad. This is the kind of personalities they've got. This is the work they're suited toward. One thing that we'll see, and this happens way more frequently in the work, but you're getting just a small excerpt of this pretty big book. Daniel talks about who he is by giving Jeopardy categories that would say something about his identity. And then he gives a little bit of information about who he is, what his professional background is, what his personal life is like. So you just get a sense of him largely as an individual. And then finally, he gives this outline of what the living situation is for the Microsoft employees. Where do they live? Who do they live with? What is that structure like? Okay? So this Friday section is really intended to give you a sense of not just the narrator's personality, but what does this kind of corporate life look like? Because with the Rabbit is Rich excerpt, we're getting a 1980s guy, or late 1970s, early 1980s, middle-class guy who's older, who's middle-aged, and he is co-owner of his business. We're getting a very different sort of setup with microserves. This is a corporation, this is a newer type of industry, and this is a very particular type of work environment and worker that we're addressing here. So you have one question and one question only. to go with this, and this is your classwork assignment number 2. So so your question, the one and only question, what insight does Daniel give into the ways Microsoft workers' professional lives affect their personal lives? What does their work-life balance look like? And how is this work-life balance similar to and different from some of the previous works we've read? I would say think about with that second part of the question, or I'm sorry, the third part of the question, thinking about some of our Gilded Era works, our Progressive Era works. Is there time for a personal life for some of these people? Is there anybody who's able to balance home life and work life really well? And you don't have to talk about this super specifically, but I would say be able to pinpoint, is what Daniel's talking about a change over time, okay? So with this question that you've got, this 3-part question, again, 3 to 4 sentences will work. More is completely fine too, as long as you address all 3 parts of that question. So just to recap everything, you've got 2 classwork assignments. One of them is to answer the 2 questions from Rabbit is Rich. One of them is to answer the only question right now from Microserfs. So a total of 3 questions that you have: 2 from Rabbit is Rich, 1 from Microserfs, 3 to 4 sentences, per question to answer those. So if you have, like 9 to 12, even upwards of like 15 sentences total, completely fine. And then, of course, the big thing, final draft of your essay 2. Remember, that needs to be 4 pages. You don't have any secondary source requirements. Remember the criteria, what this essay should look like, structure-wise, things of that nature. So you've got those things. Upload the 3 questions to the Dropbox titled Updike and Copeland assignments, and then upload your essay to the Essay 2 Dropbox. Both due Friday, April 3rd, 11:59 p.m. to cover all of your grades for the week. So if you need anything, call me or text me, email me. I'm glad to help, and just keep in touch with anything that might come up where I can be of help. I will talk to you soon, and I hope you have a good week.